Hi everyone, I'm Julia Coffey. I'm an associate professor in sociology here at the University of Newcastle, and I'm really happy to be giving you the lecture today on sex, gender and sexuality in Soccer 1010. So this week, the first part of the lecture will be exploring sociological perspectives of gender. We'll define sex and gender and the gender binary and explore some sociological historical perspectives. Then we'll move through to look at gender theory and look at social change and masculinities and feminist theory, sexuality and gender. So for part one, sociological perspectives of gender. Let's start from the very beginning. You may have learned this before, it may be totally new. But in sociological understandings, sex refers to the biological and physiological referenced categories, e.g. male, female or intersex. And gender refers to the social, cultural and psychological qualities that are projected upon human bodies, like masculinity and femininity. So how we define sex and gender is important because it's one of the primary categories of identity that we have. It's a really important part of how we know ourselves and how we present ourselves to the world. And most importantly for sociologists, it feels like the most personal characteristic we have, who we are, our gender identity. But it's also fundamentally social and cultural, because these categories might feel so natural and normal to us that, you know, a woman is just a woman, a man is just a man. That is absolutely socially and culturally contingent. These categories and what we mean by them, what behaviours and expectations relate to these categories, do change a lot over time, as we're going to explore in this lecture. Really importantly, sociological understandings of gender and sex go beyond these two categories as binaries. In the last slide, we talked about sex, male or female primarily. This sort of is the ultimate binary, but this is challenged or is much more complicated in contemporary daily life. So the assumption that sex is natural, it's bodily, and therefore determines masculinity and femininity, which is the social expectations or norms that relate to those biological categories, is termed the gender binary. There are a range of problems with the gender binary, particularly with the assumption that biological features should map neatly onto gender performances or the ways that men and women live their lives. There are a whole range of inbuilt assumptions we're going to have a look at today. There's been increasing research and attention to the binary too, as the lives of transgender and non-binary people become more visible. These people have always existed, have always been a part of everyday life, but have not been visible, have often not been able to express or live in the ways that they wanted to, because of the social cultural norms and punishments for transgressing the gender binary or for not aligning with these so-called natural characteristics where sex and gender are one and the same and map neatly onto each other. They don't for a range of people and for a range of reasons. So yeah, there's been a range of damage that the gender binary has caused for people whose sex assigned at birth doesn't align with their lived experiences of gender. And terms such as transgender and cisgender are used by contemporary scholars, feminists and a range of other social scientists, and are very common in medicine and science now, to denaturalize the sex and gender binary. So cisgender is when your biological sex does align with your gender identity and expression, and transgender is when it does not. It can be more diverse as well. Non-binary is when you don't align with either of the binary categories available and is a middle term, and they use they/them pronouns. So we study gender to develop an understanding of how our gendered identities structure our interactions, what they mean in our daily lives. And it's really important to look at what these are made up of, how they're comprised, because some of the major inequalities in life still relate to gender or are still mapped onto gender. And we'll look at a range of different ways that men and women have different outcomes, different lives that are available to them, as well as transgender and non-binary people. There's a range of different assumptions and associations with our identities. So we don't just merely get to decide what these are. Society, we are born into a world where gender norms are decided for us, or we must negotiate how we live alongside them, whether we want to challenge them or not from the moment we're born. So to understand how gender shapes how we view ourselves and others is a really important part of social analysis. It has been for the last 20 or 30 years or more. It's also important to understand to create an understanding of how gender structures form the basis of power and resource allocation for people differently and unequally. So around what kinds of work is expected from different people based on sex and gender, and also to create an understanding of how gender roles and rules or normative constructions constrain everybody, really, but not in the same ways. And there are particular rules and roles that benefit particular groups more than others. So as sociology is interested in understanding, the structural, the cultural and historical formations of how life and behaviour, the world has come to be how it is, gender is a fundamental part of who we are and our social fabric. So sociology of sex and gender is really around exploring or interrogating those taken for granted views of men and women in society, to look at what it actually is like to be a person in contemporary society, to look at what's expected of us, and how different stratifications and arrangements of society are formed through gender norms. So, as I've been saying, sociology really emphasises that once you take from the beginning, I suppose, that sex does not necessarily map neatly onto gender expression, then you can start to understand that these are not deterministic categories, and that it's important to, I guess, pull them apart and to see how they could be made differently, or just to allow more space for people to be able to live in a range of different gendered ways that do not conform to the binary. And to recognise, that it doesn't intrinsically belong to male and female bodies. There is a range of diversity around sexed bodies. There are categories of intersex and many, many more in between. Male and female are so much more than just body parts. As we'll look at some other theorists later on, there are a range of different ways this can be understood. So it's, I guess, much messier and more complex than dominant societal conversations certainly would have us believe. And this gives us a range of space, I think, to talk about how it could be different. So in relation to power and inequalities, sociology identifies patriarchy essential to the experience of being male or female. So in terms of power relations and I guess historical patterns of the ways whole societies and cultures have been organised, certainly in the past couple of hundred years or so. Society has been male-dominated in terms of who is in public-facing roles, who makes decisions, who creates how the world looks, and how social relations are produced. So patriarchy meaning male-dominated, head of the family, male-led, male-dominated. So this impacts men's lives as much as women's, but of course the power relationships are different because there are different costs and expectations associated with patriarchy and with the, I guess, embedded hierarchy that goes along with gender and sexual norms and male-dominated forms of power. So you've already learned about three main theoretical perspectives on gender inequality in the course. So these are three, I guess, classical sociological foundations, where functionalism is looking at how gender inequality is an orderly mechanism for actually dividing labour and allocating rewards. So functionalism kind of sees gender inequality is inevitable and kind of useful. Conflict theory sees gender inequality as a form of social stratification in which men dominate women, and that this is a problem. So this is a more Marxist perspective, where, you know, subordination is seen to be a problem rather than as a useful aspect. And symbolic interaction is around seeing how gender inequality is transmitted through socialization, and that's obviously a key part of childhood for many young people today, or children. So these are, I guess, some of the most common classical views of gender and inequality in sociology. So functionalist Parsons developed the idea of the nuclear family, and it looks at the ways that these roles play into the broader machine of society and to help it function in a particular way. So this functionalist gender perspectives are inherently essentialist, means that I guess it sees that men are constructed as being better suited for an instrumental role. Doesn't do much to discourage that view, and women are constructed as being better suited for an expressive role. So you can see that the naturalisation of gender inequality works quite well through functionalism, and many kind of more conservative views of gender and societal organisations rely on this kind of like naturalist, functionalist. Things just work well if people perform these roles that they are better suited to. It does say constructed here. Conflict theory and gender are around how historically men have had access to most of society's resources and privileges. You can certainly see that in how most countries' political arrangements look in terms of the number of men and women, or the vast many number of men in positions of power. And then, of course, it's in the interest of men to maintain their dominant position here to resist trends towards gender inequality. So it's around trying to how they can shore up their power. And symbolic interactionism looks at how gender is socially constructed, maintained and reproduced just in the day-to-day activities of everyday life, particularly through say clothing, for example, or through language and speech, the different words we use to praise girls versus boys, and the role of sex socialization is powerful here in sort of maintaining the illusion, I suppose, that boys and girls are just inherently completely different based on biology. So I'll come back in the second part where I'll talk more about gender theory.